welcome Loretta Ross to the Manhattan community, to Kansas State University campus, and to this year's Community Cultural Harmony Week. Loretta?
Thank you, love. Am I live? Am I on? Can you hear me? All right. Unfortunately, they tell me that this lecture will be recorded for later rebroadcast over the radio. I'm somewhat disappointed in that because that means I have to keep it clean according to the FCC. I don't want to get bleeped like they did the awards the other day. Oh, I want to appreciate y'all for having me come to your campus. It is really a great honor to be at the Lou Douglas Lecture. I looked on the website before coming, and I looked at all the really great and fabulous people y'all had before me, and I'm like, they got me now. I can say I hung out with those people, as long as you don't pay any particular attention to time and detail. I'm here to talk for about 45 minutes, and then we're going to take a Q&A, and it's a departure from my usual style, because I actually prefer people that interrupt me with questions so that we can get more of a dialogue going than the straight-up monologue. I'm dangerous, actually, when you give me a mic, because I might just talk about anything. I've already told people about Elvis, and we talked about the Dallas Cowboys, because I'm from Texas, and I know we're insufferable. You just got to grow up there to understand. You know, I spent the first 10 years in school learning Texas history, and it wasn't until the 11th grade they told me we were embedded in a country called America. We thought Texas was the country. And unfortunately, we've sent some flawed representatives of our country. To other places. I mean, don't punish us. I mean, the late, great Molly Ivins had a wonderful phrase. You know, in Texas, we call a small bush a shrub. He's our gift to America, but that's another issue. I'm trying to keep this clean, and y'all ain't helping. But I am honored to be here. I think what I'm going to talk about tonight mainly is about the concept of human rights, because the title of my lecture is Bringing Human Rights Home. But before I get to the more formal didactic portion of it, I'd like to tell you a little bit more about me, because I swear I did not come out of my mother's womb and out of my father's arms thinking I was going to be a social justice activist. That is not quite how it happened. I come from a very conservative family. My father was in the military for most of his life, 26 years, a lifer. My mother was a staunch Christian woman who believed that girls could not leave the house unless they wore bra, panties, slip, girdle, and high heels and stockings. That was what she considered a lady proper dress was. So I think my first act of rebellion was to take my girdle off. With that background, I actually was a bit of a science geek. And so when I went to college, I majored in chemistry and physics. Big mistake. Not because I don't love science. I actually do write science fiction. I love that kind of geeky stuff, and my son's an engineer and all of this other stuff. But something happened on the way to the laboratory for me. Before I even got to college, I was 15 years old when I became pregnant in high school. And it was the habit of high schools in the 1960s to expel girls for being pregnant. They just kicked you to the curb. And this kind of made me mad. Not only were they putting me out of school, but there was nothing being done to the boys. It was like it was an immaculate conception or something. And then this high school counselor had the nerve to tell me, well, Loretta, you know how they talk with those pursed lips to make you want to slap somebody? No, Loretta, the reason we can't let you come back to school is because other girls might get pregnant. I'm like, I haven't even taken biology yet, and I know that's a physical impossibility. I cannot impregnate somebody else. Kick the boys out if you want to protect the girls. Anyway, my parents and I had to sue my school system for my right to return to school when I was 15 years old. And that became my first feminist act, long before I could even spell the F word. I didn't know it at the time. It's totally revisionist history for me to go back and say I had consciousness then. No, they just pissed me off. But I learned at that tender age that you can take on a really big institution and kick their butts and make them not only change the policies for my high school, but eventually created this ripple effect that changed the policies throughout the state. So that within 5 years, they couldn't kick girls out of school anymore for being pregnant. They finally recognized that it's just possible that the girls who most need an education are the young mothers of our society. It had never occurred to them to put those two things together. Now, our society still provides absolutely lousy support from young mothers, so it's not like they figured that part out. But at least they did figure out that girls don't impregnate other girls. Girls should be allowed to stay in school. And it is sex discrimination if you only choose one of the partnership to expel. They got that part. I told you we're slow in Texas. Did I tell you that? Anyway, I tell you that story to say that I became a political activist at age 15. I continued to be so when I went to college. That's how I ended up in the anti-rape movement in my very early 20s. I was lucky enough to become director of the first rape crisis center in this country. I've seen a global movement to end violence against women spring from the efforts of the DC Rape Crisis Center, where I was. And I am one of those very privileged people who has had an entire career in social justice work. The way I put it is that all of us have to put up with oppression. You know, there's nobody exempt. There's nobody walking around in a bubble where we can't get hurt, where we don't have somebody mess with us. Everybody gets to put up with oppression, but a very few of us who do social justice work actually get paid to fight it. And that is a very privileged position to be in. You get up happy to be alive every day because you get patted on your back for doing this work while somebody else is just trying to survive the 9 to 5 so that they can get to their real life after work. And this work becomes your real life. So I'll tell you that story about how I got here. Give me a minute. Put the water behind me. And now I lost my tether. Yeah, you know I try to keep it clean. I'm gonna try. I just can't guarantee this. You know what made me so, you never want to curse so much as when they tell you you can't. It's just hard. Anyway, keeping it clean. Because I entered the anti-rape movement first, my first social justice work was women's rights work. And I went from women's rights to civil rights, which is kind of backwards for a black woman in America because obviously in the 60s there was this huge civil rights movement going on. I was totally oblivious. I was living on a military base. My father outranked most of the white people around me. And so it's different when the sins of the children are visited on the fathers. It's hard to explain the military. Anybody else, a military family around here? Y'all know what I'm talking about, right? I see a lot of hands in here. So if anybody had ever dared call me the N-word when I was growing up, my father could have had them busted in rank. So when I first heard it, I remember going home to my mom. I said, Mom, what's an N? She said, where'd you hear that? I said, I don't know. Debbie called me one and I called her one back. So I wasn't really aware of the civil rights movement growing up. I was too late to experience segregated bathrooms and stuff like that. I do remember one funny story, though. My father was stationed at Fort Belvoir, Virginia, and we were moving to San Antonio, Texas, Fort Sam, around that area. And my father's an immigrant from Jamaica. Came over here right after World War I when they invited a lot of Caribbean immigrants to make up for our labor shortage. They always do that. They invite them in to make up the labor and then accuse them of everything once we decide we don't need them anymore. We cycle through that script a lot in our society. But anyway, we were driving from Fort Belvoir to Texas in a Woody, one of those station wagons with the wood paneling, and I'm one of 8 kids, so there were 5 kids in the car, my mom and my dad, and we stopped at this gas station. This was 1963. We stopped at this gas station in Mississippi. And it was back in the days when people actually pumped the gas. You talk about throwback. And so while the guy was pumping the gas for my dad went to use the bathroom. Road trip, that's what you do. And so as my dad is coming out the bathroom, zipping up his pants, the attendant tells him, "You used the wrong bathroom." And my dad looked up and said, "No, I used the men's room." Oblivious, like I said. And so the attendant said, "No, you were supposed to go in the back. You were supposed to use the colored bathroom." And my father said, "Well, what do you want me to do, suck it back in?" That was about my experience. Now, of course, Dad probably was in the military when it was desegregated, so he had a wholly different set of stories to tell. So anyway, enough of my bio. You can see I've had a wonderful life. I come from a wonderful family. That baby I had at 15 is now 40 years old. He's made me a grandmother. I have an 11-year-old grandson that I absolutely adore. I am totally convinced that your grandchildren are your reward for not killing your kids. So if you just hang on, you get to the good stuff. Parenting without responsibilities. I went into civil rights work when I was invited to take a job monitoring hate groups in America. And so I actually spent an inordinate amount of time being the only black person going to Klan rallies, which, as you can imagine, is a interesting, challenging job. And you can imagine me trying to tell my mother what I did for a living. She didn't get it at all. But we did this for the purpose of monitoring the backlash to the civil rights movement, what was happening there. And one of the things we discovered in doing this monitoring, that a lot of the discourse we have in our society today is initiated by the organized white supremacist movement. And I know that sounds pretty harsh because people say, well, why would you pay attention to the boys in the hoods? I mean, after all, who actually joins the Klan anymore? The militia movement, the neo-Nazi movement. And what we found is that in the 1960s, even with the passage of the Civil Rights Act of '64, they started organizing to argue that civil rights is reverse discrimination. And even though they ran that trial balloon in the 1960s, by 1977, the Supreme Court agreed with them with the Bakke decision, claiming somehow that white people were the victims of racial discrimination in a country run by white people. I still don't get that one, but the Supremes, they're interesting. The other thing that was interesting about monitoring hate groups is that they predicted our current debate on immigration. They wanted to halt all non-white immigration to this country. Now, they didn't have any problem with immigrants from Europe or South Africa or Australia. It was the brown people coming over the border that they were concerned about. And they would truly be pimples on the asshole of time. Oh. If it weren't for the fact that their trial balloons of the 1960s became our public policies of the 1990s. And it's not like David Duke, the Klansman, picks up the phone and calls the White House and tells them what to do. So we monitor these hate groups so that we can predict where some of these debates are going on in our society. They are now, no, not now, but about 20 years ago, they started advocating for the concept that the children born of immigrants who have not been legalized yet should not be counted as U.S. citizens. Flying in the teeth of hundreds of years of history that says if you're born here, you belong here. And now you're hearing pundits on the news talking about that same concept. You know, oh, they're only here to get benefits, blah, 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 and let's kick them out and their kids too. Now today in my human rights education training, we actually speculated how much really kicking immigrants out would cost. And I'm not talking about financial, I'm talking about the total and absolute disruption of the food chain you and I depend upon. Because frankly, I ain't growing no lettuce in my backyard. Most of us aren't. I'm not raising any beef up the road. And I definitely am not picking any tomatoes, grapes, watermelons, all those kinds of things. And so we're not even looking at the logical consequences of some of these policies. So after I did hate group work for a while, I actually had another transition in my life. One of my jobs doing hate group work was to work with people who were leaving the hate movement, like defectors, I guess you would call them. And one of these people I work with is a man named Floyd Cochran, who had been the national spokesman for the Aryan Nations up at Hayden Lake, Idaho. And Floyd had been a Nazi since he was 14, and he was 35 then. And he was probably still would have been a Nazi except for one small problem. And that was that his second son was born with a cleft palate. And his Nazi buddies told him that he was a genetic defect who needed to be put to death. And Floyd said, uh-oh, maybe I'm not hanging around with the right people. Because it was a whole other thing to be talking about putting together Jews and people of color and queers and all that other stuff as the victims of Nazi hatred. But when that hatred came home, it didn't feel so good. So Floyd decided to defect from the Aryan Nations, and because he was a very good recruiter of skinheads, he decided to go on a national speaking tour to apologize for having recruited so many skinheads into the movement who had committed so many crimes. In particular, the set of skinheads he recruited in Allentown, Pennsylvania, named Freeman, came home and murdered their entire family one year, including their 12-year-old brother, their mother, their father. And Floyd felt particularly guilty about that. So Floyd and I became a traveling road show, which was kind of bizarre because here we are immediately looking like an interracial couple. You know, the social justice activist with the former Nazi. And we ended up on a lot of television shows, most notably the Jerry Springer Show. I don't put that on the resume because it's just too deep and too much to explain. You know, I'll talk about Good Morning America. Who tells anybody they've been on Springer? Even for the right reasons. But it was while we were traveling around, Floyd asked me a very pertinent and poignant question once. He said, well, Loretta, now that I've left the hate movement, where's the movement I can belong to? And I have to honestly say he stumped me for a minute. Because I was like, well, you know, you don't have to be black to join the civil rights movement. He said, somehow, I don't think the civil rights movement is ready for an ex-Nazi. I said, you're probably right. And I know you're not ready for the women's movement because you're still sleeping around on your wife. So I don't know where you go. Fortunately for me, I didn't have to answer that question alone. Because I was working within the civil rights movement, I took it to one of the iconic figures of the civil rights movement, Reverend C.T. Vivian, who I absolutely encourage you to invite as one of the future lecturers. Dr. Vivian was National Field Director for Dr. Martin Luther King, and his wife Octavia actually has written the only authorized biography on Coretta Scott King. So he's one of these people. He organized the first sit-in in this country in the civil rights movement in the 1940s in Peoria, Illinois, not that far from here. And so when Floyd asked me this question, I went to Reverend Vivian because it was Reverend Vivian that had gotten me into this mess. He came to work one day, and he was chair of our board, so he came to my office one day, and he said, well, Loretta, we're going to add this aspect of the program where you work with people who are leaving the hate groups. And I was like, what you talking about? Because it was all I could do to work against people in the hate groups. Now you're telling me I got to work with them? And who believes these people are truly defecting anyway? I mean, what's up with that? And he said something that I had to listen to. He said, well, we're asking people to give up hate, so we have to be there when they do. And I went, he's right. And so that's how I ended up working with Floyd. So I take this back to the man that got me into this mess. Reverend Vivian surprised me when I took him Floyd's question about what movement could he join. Because Reverend Vivian said, well, you know, Martin. Now, he knew Dr. King well enough to say, Martin. The rest of us say, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., like it's one word. But he said, Martin never meant to build a civil rights movement. I was like, what you talking about? Because every time they say Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, they say civil rights leader too, like that's his second name. He said, no. Martin meant to build a human rights movement. And I have to honestly say he stunned me. And he pointed me in the direction of Dr. King's last Sunday sermon, which was delivered March 31st, 1968, only 4 days before he was assassinated, in which Dr. King said, and I'm paraphrasing, that we're in the midst of a triple revolution. We've got a revolution in technology, and I don't know what he would be saying about the internet now. We have a revolution in weaponry with our ability to destroy the earth many times over. He said, but the greatest revolution is the human rights revolution with the freedom explosion taking place all over the world. And we've got to bring America to that revolution. And then 4 days later, he was killed. So I have to honestly say I was stunned because I was like, wait a minute, everybody told me Dr. King had a dream. Nobody told me he had a plan. That we were supposed to move from civil rights to build a human rights movement. And then I said to Reverend Vivian, why don't I know anything about this? I mean, I'm alert. I read. I'm an activist. I've been in this movement by then 25 years. How can I not know this? And he said, well, it's kind of hard to fight for rights you don't know you have. I said, okay. So my path became clear. So I rushed back to Floyd and said, Floyd, we've got to build a human rights movement. And he looked at me like I'd lost my mind. But he understood. He said, we've got to build a movement where everybody is included and nobody's left out. I said, well, that's more easily said than done. I actually had to stop working with Floyd after a while, not because of anything negative, but because Stars, does the movie things, optioned our story, and when they wrote the script, they pretended that Floyd had left the Aryan nations because he fell in love with a black woman, which simply was not working for me. First of all, the chances of me falling in love with a Nazi are very slim. Secondly, Floyd is about the size of one of my thighs, which is even more important. And the chance of me falling in love with a white guy about that tall and about that big are really, really slim. And I say that in jest. Floyd is actually doing great work. He's actually helping to convince skinheads to stay out of the movement or to join the anti-racist skinhead movement. So it's not that I split with Floyd, but it is terrible when Hollywood gets your story and they distort it all out of recognition and stuff. So they haven't made the movie because we haven't given them permission to use that script yet. I mean, I have a reputation to think of. And, I don't think people should sleep their way into or out of the social justice movement. But that's my feminist principle speaking up. Anyway, since I'm probably running out of time, I want to take y'all where I had to be taken after my conversation with Dr. Vivian. Because I had to learn about human rights. It's a phrase that I'd heard all my life, but I didn't know what it means. And I bet you I was in a situation that many of you are in. How many of you, by a show of hands, have heard the phrase human rights? Raise your hands. That's pertinent to everybody in the room. How many of you, by that same show of hands, can name the 8 categories of human rights protections to which we are all entitled? Look around the room. Not one hand is up. Disappointingly, not even the hands of the people in my earlier lecture. So, we're in a situation where there's this concept out there called human rights, about which we know very little, because in our minds, when somebody says that phrase, we think of the tortured prisoner in a jail overseas. We don't think of human rights as applying to us, to our lives. But the concept of human rights that I'm talking about actually originated fairly recently. Not originated like that was the first time of it. Every human society has had rules on how people should treat each other, from biblical days to the Code of Hammurabi to Confucius. So let's not talk about human rights originating that recently, but the modern concept of human rights originated right after World War II, when the world community recognized that the Holocaust that Nazi Germany had perpetrated against people it didn't like Jews and homosexuals and communists and labor activists and all of that, while it was immoral, it was not illegal. Because, like any government, it legitimated immorality when it was the immorality it wanted to practice. Now, if you're having trouble wrapping your mind around that concept, think of how America legitimated the immorality of slavery. It was immoral, but not illegal. You follow me there? So we were part of a great project to construct a body of laws, standards, and norms to put in place to prohibit that type of genocidal aggression by a government against its own people. You follow me? That's the origin of the modern concept of human right. To regulate, if you will, the relationship between a people and their own government. And in 1948, former First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt chaired the committee that wrote the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, presenting it to the United Nations for approval December 10th, 1948, which is now why December 10th is forever known as Human Rights Day. And the United States actually urged, and some might say bullied, every country in the United Nations to sign that document. It probably was our proudest moment in foreign policy, that if we had stood in the way of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights being passed, it would not exist, because we were the superpower after World War II. But we wanted it, and we made it happen. So I'm going to talk about the human rights that were in that document in 1948, and then other human rights that have emerged since then. In the original Universal Declaration of Human Rights, they spelled out 5 categories of human rights protection. Get your pens out, because this can be your notes to prove that you were here for your professors. The first category is called civil rights, which are your right to be treated without discrimination. They are equality rights. We are familiar with civil rights because there was a whole civil rights movement that was about achieving equality, non-discrimination. The second category is called political human rights. Now, these are rights that you mostly learned about in your early civics class when they taught you about the Bill of Rights, freedom of speech, freedom of association, the right to vote. Those are political human rights. Though we have to be particularly vigilant because we're the first generation to learn that while we have the right to vote, we don't have the right to have our votes counted. And I was telling the earlier class that I am really incredulous that the same people, Diebold, D-I-E-B-O-L-D, who make my ATM machine at Wachovia Bank and can give me a receipt for my ATM transactions, also makes my ballot box that can't give me a receipt. I don't get that. So getting our votes counted, or the failure to count our votes, is probably one of the most significant threats to our democracy to date. Because how can you persuade people to participate in the system when the system would say, and if you happen to live in Florida or Ohio or one of those other places and we don't want to count your votes anymore, we're not going to. Anyway, let me move on. I'm trying to keep it clean. The third category is called economic human rights. These are the rights to have our economy managed in such a way that we actually can live, survive, and thrive. So our right to a living wage is an economic human right. One of my favorite economic human rights is the right to rest and leisure, so that no one can make you work 7 days a week unless you work for a social justice organization. The fourth category is called social human rights. Now, these are human rights that are born out of your human needs. Your right to food, your right to health care, education, shelter. These are your basic human needs translated into human rights. And the fifth category is called cultural human rights. That's the right to practice the culture of your choice, the religion of your choice, to speak the language of your choice. The entire English-only movement, by definition, is in violation of people's cultural human rights. Just think, every time you print a flyer in a language other than English, you're actually a human rights defender, and you didn't even know it. So those are the 5 categories they laid out in 1948. Human rights, though, arise all the time out of new social movements, just like we got those first 5 out of social movements. And so in the 1970s or thereabouts, some bright soul finally recognized that if we didn't have clean air and clean water, we wouldn't be around very long to enjoy the other human rights. And so environmental human rights became the 6th category, which of course has been extended to a challenge why We are being fed genetically modified food without our permission. Why we can't make sure our food chain in America is safe. Those kinds of real interesting questions some people would rather we didn't ask. The seventh category is called developmental rights. These are a little more difficult to understand because these are rights demanded by the developing countries around the world to control their own natural resources. So some of us could argue that our war against Iraq is in violation of their developmental rights because we've never explained how our oil got under their sand. Every war that is taking place today is over natural resources, whether it's the oil in Darfur, the blood diamonds running through Africa, the timber wars of Liberia. All of that is about natural resources, where one former colonial country arms one side, the other colonial country arms another side. Whoever wins, that country gets the spoils. So we don't have to send our military over there to do it anymore, except for Iraq. We can do it through surrogates. And then the eighth category, which is the one that the women's movement demanded, and it's the one that I get the most pleasure out of, both literally and metaphorically, is called sexual human rights. And these are rights demanded by the women's movement. The right to determine if and when we'll have sex, if and when we'll marry, if and when we'll have children. The right to abortion turns out to be a human right. The right to sexual pleasure turns out to be a human right. So that's my favorite. And these rights sounded like such a good idea that once we named them, then suddenly the gay and lesbian movement said, hey, that sounds good. We want the right to decide if and when we'll marry, if and when we have children, if and when we'll have sex, under what conditions, et cetera, et cetera. So more than any other social movement other than the women's movement, you find the queer rights movement using the sexual rights framework. Put that all together and you've got the human rights we all should be fighting for. And there's a real reason why they aren't teaching us about our human rights. I mean, let me just use one example that's going to immediately get me in trouble here at K-State. If every human being has a human right to education, why are we paying for it? Answer me that one. If it's my human right, then like air and breathable water and stuff like that, then why is my PhD program at Emory University costing $26,000 a year? I suspect therein lies the reason why our human rights aren't being taught to us at any point in our educational careers. Because if we knew our rights, by God, we might demand them. We might challenge the miseducation that's taking place here. The thwarting of our dreams as we go into student loan debt, trying to fit into the matrix that's constantly screwing us. So, you know how Mel Gibson said he believed in conspiracies? Well, I'm kind of on Mel Gibson-ish. I don't look like him, but I do believe there's a conspiracy out here. Because how can the Universal Declaration of Human Rights be more than 50 years old and not be taught in our school system anywhere when we led the whole world into adopting this document? That has never made sense to me. And what's even more outrageous, we tend to use human rights as a bully weapon to beat up on other countries about their alleged human rights record, while we are the worst performing country in the world when it comes to ratifying and upholding human rights treaties. That sounds a bit hard to swallow because we are living in the most privileged country in the world. But there are 26 human rights treaties out there emanating from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Treaties that include things like the Treaty Against Landmines, the Treaty on the Rights of Women, the Treaty on the Rights of the Child, the Convention on Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, et cetera, the Kyoto Accords around global warming and all of that kind of stuff that you hear about in the news. Of those 26 treaties, the United States has only ratified 3 of them. The only country that has done fewer treaties doesn't have a government. It's called Somalia. So there's a lot of arrogance in our belief that we can model for anybody human rights when we are in fact a rogue state when it comes to complying with the rest of the regime we're trying to hold other countries accountable for. American women are the only Western women in the world who do not have a women's human rights treaty. It's going to be introduced in Congress next week for the umpteenth time since President Carter signed it in 1979. But I don't hear it being talked about on CNN as they tell me even more dreary details about O.J. Simpson. Do I care? I didn't even think he was that good a football player. I mean, go there. But I'm just saying that there is a huge gap between our perception of our relationship to human rights and the reality of how we practice and achieve human rights. And so that's why the title of my speech tonight is Bring Human Rights Home. Because human rights don't belong out there if they're not applied here. If you believe every child has a right to an education, that's one thing. That's that person's human rights. But a blind child might need her books in Braille. That's her difference. That's her special need. We all have special needs, by the way. Yeah, we may not be as obviously disabled, but we all start at different starting places in life. And it is paying attention to those starting places that determine whether or not we get our human rights realized. So differences matter in the human rights world. They just matter in a different way. Differences don't matter so that you can discriminate with them. Differences matter so that you can take them into account in protecting people's human rights. Does that make sense to people? So I'm not saying we're all going to form some little formless blob melting down into this colorblind, non-gender specific mess. We're going to keep our individual identities. So that means that we have to build a human rights movement using a new way of thinking, because as a feminist, I have to become the women's wing of the human rights movement. If I care about the environment, I'm the environmental wing of the human rights movement. If I care about the protection of pro athletes, I'm the athletic wing of the human rights movement. What I'm saying is, we can all focus on that issue that we're passionate about, but we can do it in a way using the human rights framework that causes us to build a united movement for human rights versus separated movements based on identity politics. What's so exciting about that vision is that it ain't never been done before. You know, I used to regret that I was too old to experience segregation, because I always thought the good stuff happened before I was born. You know, I would have liked to punch somebody, you know? Not quite the nonviolent person Dr. King wanted me to be. I was like, let me go sit at that lunch counter. Let me find an opportunity. Yeah. But all that was over by the time I got old enough to know what a lunch counter was. So there was always a little regret in my soul that it seemed like the good stuff was over. But once I discovered the human rights framework, I discovered, wow, no, we got some unfinished business here. And this is our chance to do that. Nobody's done it before, to actually build a united human rights movement in this country. So that's my charge to you, like the guy says, mission impossible, if you choose to accept it. You can pick up the mantle where I'm leaving it off, learning about your human rights, learning about the rights you are entitled to, teaching others about their human rights, making sure you don't send your children to college without them knowing about their human rights. Just those basic things we could do. And maybe we can make the 21st century the century of human rights, the way the people opposed to human rights made the 20th century the century of war. We can do this differently, and we have a wonderful opportunity. And thank y'all for listening to me tonight.